Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I have a couple of interesting things, at least interesting to me to start with, because they're rather broad questions. The first one is, what's really going on with family life today? It's pretty broad, isn't it? But here's what is going on. Marriages are down. The marriage rate is down. People are older, that is, of course, people are living longer, and they're older when they do marry. More people are simply living together, cohabitating, than ever before. And even those who plan to get married, sometimes they'll set the date but not the year. Divorces, in spite of all this thing about trial marriages and people living together to see if they can get along, divorces are up rather sharply. That's strange, isn't it? I think it's strange. The rate of remarriage, people remarrying, is down. Of course, what happens so often is that people simply live together. Live together instead of remarrying. Now, sometimes there's a penalty for marriage. You've been hearing about penalty taxes. Married couples do pay higher taxes than single people. And the number of babies, or the birth rate, born out of wedlock, that's up. The number of babies born to unmarried people. Single parenting is up. Obviously, if the baby rate is up for unmarried, then the single parenting is up. But single parenting doesn't necessarily mean even cohabitators, people living together. The single parenting simply people have babies and don't bother to get married. Sometimes people are living together and you see mixed families. There'll be a baby from this person and a baby from that person, and then the people aren't married, and then there are babies from that couple. That's what's really going on in much more numbers, greater numbers. The next question is what happened as a result of all those things? What's going on because of those things? And suicide rates are up sharply in the youth. Child abuse rates are up. Now, I've mentioned on this program 2 or 3 times about child abuse increasing a great deal when a mother has a boyfriend take care of the children. I'm not sure if that's a real factor in the overall the national figures, but the child abuse rates are up. And overall there's a rise in alcohol and drug use. That's overall. In some age groups it's different. Violence in families is up. People are more violent than they used to be. Welfare dependency is certainly up. And that's related, of course, to the single parenting. People, some people, that's just the way of life, to be on welfare. And, of course, single parenting typically sets up the pattern for welfare, and welfare and single parenting sets up the pattern for all sorts of other social ills. I'm going to say ills because basically that's not good for society. So those are some of the things that are going on in family life. Here's a question that's related. This all came from a conversation. It says, is there any real evidence that what you talk about in marriage is true? What are the advantages of getting married? People say, well, we won't get married now. Too many people are going through that and come down on the wrong side and for the wrong reasons. Decide not to get married. It's puzzling to me. I've watched this now for quite a while. People who are married, the evidence, and I've mentioned this on this program several times, people who are married are healthier and happier compared to those who aren't. You say, well, how do you know? Well, Some people may know what a level of confidence is when speaking about statistically. The level of confidence for this means that the statement that people who are married are healthier and happier compared to those who are not. If you did random samples almost from now on, only about 1 in 1,000 times would you find the evidence different. So that means about 999 times out of 1,000, that's what you're going to find if you do random samples. Sexually transmitted disease is much higher in people who are single, parenting, and cohabitating. Sexually transmitted disease is related to infant mortality. Pretty high significance there, and statistically. Violent crimes are up with people who have sexually transmitted diseases. People who are depressed. You take a high school student, premarital sex, much more likely to get STDs. Get STDs sets up a whole pattern of things that go on. One of them being joblessness and continuing on poverty, continuing on welfare. There's not any really good moral or social reason, or certainly not a spiritual reason, for not marrying people who find the right ones. I find this all the time. So what's really happening is people are putting a price tag on it. They're not marrying for economic reasons. In other words, two people having two households, unmarried, it's more expensive to support two households. Pay two rents, that sort of thing. Of course it's more expensive. So what are we really saying? What's your price? What's your price? That's not a very good question, is it? But that's really what's involved. Here's another question that I just heard about some grant money being made available for abstinence education. Is that real? Well, I certainly hope it is. Abstinence education has been found to be quite good. Good research. Good research, even some very recent research in Connecticut and Georgia and New York and Puerto Rico, studying the patterns of abstaining, that is, not having premarital sex, compared to those who did. And the evidence comes out very favorable for people who are abstaining. And you take a big study like that. That was a pretty good sized study, and it was done by some very reputable people. They get some of these big name universities involved in these research projects. They really don't like sloppy research work. We have people who have premarital sex, and these are gross figures. They're more likely to be depressed, they're more likely to have higher suicide risks, they're more likely to have drugs and alcohol problems. And what is that? And why is that? It's because the people who are more likely to have premarital sex are also more likely to have value systems that allow these other things. So there's very good evidence why we should be putting our money into helping young people decide to stay chaste, to stay virgins, if you will. And it's interesting how people will change that around. In fact, there's some people say, well, everybody's doing it, why shouldn't I? Well, that's not true. Everybody isn't. The percentage who are remaining chaste, who are remaining virgin, stays pretty close to the same year in and year out. People who are having sex are having it more often with different and with more variety of people. That research I just mentioned came from the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Quite a reputable publication, too. Here's a question. It says, my wife wants to breastfeed our son, who's scheduled to be born in 2 months. I think it's silly and it would embarrass me. What do you think about it? Well, I think you might as well get used to it. If you really want the best for your son, breastfeeding's the way to go. We've known this for many years. Research evidence would find one thing or another that favored breastfeeding. But recently there was a publication came out that combined all sorts of studies, long-term studies, and found that breastfeeding is certainly better for children. Has all sorts of advantages. They sleep better, their health is better, they have fewer diseases. So any father who really wants the best for his son is not going to object to breastfeeding, or the daughter either, for that matter. Why should they? There's no real difference there. The evidence is quite clear, and by the way, Dad, you'll be sleeping longer yourself if Mother's doing the breastfeeding. She may not. Some mothers have to breastfeed about every 4 hours or even more often at first. But children can be trained to get used to it. But compared to the other methods, nah, not really. You know, some of us were talking the other day, it reminded me what all has changed. When I first had children, that's quite a few years ago now, they were still into the sterilizing the bottles and all that sort of thing. And they don't do that anymore. Never did make sense, did it? We know that people were born and reared for centuries before anybody ever knew there was a germ. So trying to sterilize the milk containers, mothers sometimes object to that. But much simpler now. But even breastfeeding still is by far and away the best way to go. Here's another question. Who started no-fault divorce? My answer is that probably the attorneys and some people who want to change society. My own research, I did a lot of research on marriage and divorce. It came into being, no-fault divorce, in 1969 in California. It kind of spread, but I was doing research before that in the early 70s about this sort of thing. And no-fault divorce did not come about because people asked for it. The vast majority of people that I ask, and I ask people in Florida, Georgia, New York, Vermont, did a pretty good sized research project. They wanted divorce to be made harder. Because no-fault divorce says rather simply, well, we'll get married, we'll go through all of the rituals and the routine, but at any time I can walk away. So in spite of all the promises I make and all the contracts we make together, either one of us can just walk out. That's what no-fault divorce is about, and that's kind of sad. It's the only kind of contract, and I've mentioned this before, it's the only contract that I know of where either party can just walk away from it without penalty. No responsibilities for the marriage itself. Here's a question. I've had this question come up before, but I thought it deserves being answered again. It says, what is the right age for a serious couple to start having sex? Now, I was asked that the other day. And it's a bold question, so I'll give a bold answer. When there's complete privacy, each partner is relaxed, not boozed up or drugged up, not under the influence of anything really interfering, when there's really plenty of time to get better acquainted, and there's nothing pressing on the schedule, and that usually comes about 16 to 24 hours after people say I do. I think that's the right age to have sex, and seems to work. I first heard that answer quite a few years ago. I've been giving it ever since. The question comes up from time to time. Because of all the media, all of the things that kids are exposed to, not just video, not just television, every kind of media. All of them seem to have, I say all, and I shouldn't say all because some of them are not that way. Most of them, that's a safer statement. Most of them seem to be bound and determined trying to get people, young people, to jump in bed, have sex, condomania, be sure to have safe sex. Well, safe sex is in a commitment, marriage. That's the only kind of safe sex there is. It's interesting how much propaganda, how much literature, how much effort goes into that. And so many people, and I've known some of the counselors, school nurses, who are very much into trying to make sure people have so-called safe sex. They're not telling them don't have sex. They're not telling them that virginity is something that's a one-time event. Losing it and it's gone. Chastity is renewable. Chastity is a renewable resource, and we all should ourselves, regardless of age, try to live a life that is in keeping with our own values. And we value some moral standards better than our own, higher than ourselves. I like the AA slogan, a power greater than ourselves. And some people object to the word God, but I don't. So I'll, without reservation, say we ought really to live a chaste life, all of us, regardless of age. And that doesn't mean celibacy. People who are married, people who have a moral, legitimate relationship, are in a chaste life if they're not violating any of the promises, and living to what they promised to do. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. 17. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start off, interesting question. Says, I have a cousin who lives in a group home and she wants to get married. And her case manager is helping her make all the arrangements. The pastor of the church where she goes said he would perform the wedding, but I have serious doubts. What's your opinion? Well, it's interesting. As a cousin, you have serious doubts. Apparently, you have no legal authority. But I think the circumstance that you described is sad. Sad for this reason. Somebody who has to have a case manager raises immediate question. Is the person mentally competent? Is the person stable enough? Is your cousin retarded, or to use a politically correct word, intellectually challenged, or some fancy word? In other words, why does this person have to have somebody to manage her life? I've had this sort of thing come up from time to time. And some of the pastors and the preachers have referred the people to me and said, do an evaluation. If in your opinion the person is competent and so on, then certainly we'll be happy to perform the wedding ceremony. And that's so often what's really involved. Sometimes I found people who they don't really have an idea what marriage is involved with. I also have the strong opinion, and I'll readily admit I'm prejudiced. See, I think people who are getting married should be willing to be responsible and have the capacity to be fully responsible, not only for themselves, but for their partner. Because all of us have been married know that from time to time, that's required. That sometimes we have to be responsible for somebody else, and or somebody has to be responsible for us sometimes. You take somebody who has to have a manager or an overseer who's mentally incompetent for whatever reason. To me, it raises a big flag. that says no, that sort of thing shouldn't really be involved in marriage, because you don't have somebody else to say, well, here's the husband or the wife, and well, the decision can't be made without a case manager or somebody, a guardian. I ask that question often, anybody coming to me, regardless of abilities, because some people are quite bright, but they're irresponsible. They're not willing to be responsible for somebody else. And I've been involved in marriage preparation for many, many, many years, and I've seen this sort of thing jump up. People want to get married. Why? Why do they want to get married? Is it for the honeymoon? Well, people today go on honeymoons before they ever decide to go steady. Yeah, they shouldn't, but that's what happens so often. Does a person have good judgment? Is a person reliable? Is a person too easily upset when things don't go right? Is a person capable of planning ahead? Is this person capable of carrying out the obligations? I've told this story, somewhere else, I recall. But I really had a pair of people who came from one of these shelters one time, where the social workers wanted to help them get married. And the couple came to me for pre-marriage work because they were sent by the pastor, who said basically he'd have to have some kind of evaluation done. And these people, in answer to the question what they knew and what they had planned and how they could care for themselves if married, they assured me that they had everything in place. They could do it. When I inquired a little bit more, it turned out they had the paper plates for the reception. And they knew somebody that worked at a paper mill, and that's where they got the paper plates. That was all. Neither of them had a job. They had not a good idea at all about what marriage and family life was supposed to be about. But they had the paper plates. And so that was enough. We have the paper plates, let's get married. Well, kind of a weird thing. It caused me to wonder about the mental ability of the people who wanted them to get married. Because sometimes caretaking people get involved. They want to do something, be helpful, and say, oh, people have certain rights. People have a right to get married. That's not a question. If they are capable of carrying out the responsibilities that go with it. Some of you may get the impression that I think people ought to pass an IQ test or something in order to be married. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I've known people who couldn't spell family, couldn't spell cat, who made very good parents. I've known some very bright people who made terrible parents. Now, it's not just intelligence. It's a capacity really to fulfill the contract when people get married. What's the purpose of it? What are the obligations? What are people willing to do? And usually that requires adequate intelligence. That doesn't mean the low endowment people, the people with modest intelligence, can't do good marriages and family life and become good parents, but the odds are certainly against them. And that's sad. Sad when people insist, usually do-gooders insist, oh, you have a right to get married, and I'll help you and all that sort of thing. Here's another question. I'm not quite sure. I think there was a movie or something that may have prompted this lately by somebody that said, is there such a thing as a bad seed in explaining criminal behavior? Well, A Bad Seed, I believe, was the title of a book, and it was made into a movie. But I think the best answer at the moment is not yet. There is not sufficient answer yet as a bad seed. That is, that people are criminals because of genes. There haven't been any found to explain the antisocial behavior found in crimes. Sure, we all know people who come from families where in effect it's a criminal family. Everybody in the family seems to live and exist on the basis of doing something illegal at a lower level than the mob families. Mob families are usually pretty well off. But there are people who really, that's their lifestyle. Petty thievery. They make a living at it. That's how they get along. There are people who do that. And, of course, what kind of children do they raise? Most of the time, the children copy their parents. But there are a few bad people who don't seem to fit any explanation of why they are that way. The psychiatric manual calls it personality disorder, antisocial, sociopath. And more men than women have that condition. And they have to be known to have been at variance to the law and to have had bad behavior in their late childhood on up. It's a very puzzling thing. People who seem to live without a conscience. People who seem to not learn from the experience of interacting with other people. It's kind of hard to be around these people. I've been around a lot of them because I worked in mental hospitals, and every place I worked had a unit for the criminally insane. So these people typically are not insane in a psychiatric sense, but they're insane according to the law. According to the law, as I recall mentioning one time on this program, the insanity is basically a person who doesn't know right from wrong, doesn't know the consequences of his act, and cannot enter into his own defense. That's the old MacNaughton rule. It's now about 150 years old, and it stood the test of time very well. You can see what a big difference that is in being mentally ill. Mentally ill people may be perfectly capable, know right from wrong, being able to know consequences. Some of them are very astute about all these things and can certainly enter into their own defense. So a person could be mentally ill and not insane. But what happened used to happen much more often than now, was one of these people who was the antisocial type do something violent. Didn't make any sense. They lie when the truth would be better. The courts didn't know what to do with them. The juries didn't know what to do with them. So what happened was that oftentimes they were simply committed to a mental hospital, or they were tried for insanity. Sometimes the crimes were so bad that people would say, well, somebody has to be insane to do that. So a disproportionate number of them wound up in mental hospitals, particularly for the maximum security units. You know what happened in the maximum security units? Usually they made ideal patients. Usually they were model people. They knew they could get along okay as long as there was obvious authority. These people could get along and did get along. But you couldn't trust them. I remember it being a very difficult thing to teach new social workers and psychologists to be careful, to try to teach them how to be careful, because some of them are really good con artists. A few are really quite bright. I knew a neurosurgeon who was one of these kind of people one time. He'd gone all the way through medical school simply because it was a lark to him, and that's what he wanted to play at and do, and he kind of pictured himself the Dr. Jekyll, and he had a very bad history. Some of them can play games. I'll give you a quick little story. One time, many years ago, when I was working in a hospital, my wife was doing something, recreation, occupational therapy, and that sort of thing, and she had a band, institutional band, hospital band, a musical going. And some of these people off the maximum security unit, very interested, talented, she'd go get them, and they'd go over with her and take the recreational activity, and then they'd be taken back. She'd take them back to the wards, and they'd go back under maximum security. One day she called me and asked me if I would go pick up the guys for her, and I said, sure, be glad to. She couldn't make it that day. Well, everything went along just right, except when we got outside, the key turned in the lock. Everybody was outside, and the door was locked behind them. They turned to me and said, we don't owe you anything. They went in all directions. There were about 5 of them. They went in 5 different directions. They thought it was fun to go with my wife. It wasn't a challenge to go with her. They could have run off from her anytime, of course. They could have run off from anybody. Anytime you have 2 people, one of them wants to run away, who do you chase and who do you keep if you're trying to keep custody of somebody? And they were not handcuffed, and they didn't have leg irons on, and so they thought it was a lot of fun to run away from me, to embarrass me, to make me feel bad about it. Well, enough sea story for that time. I'm Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. I have an interesting question to start with. Some of you may be very familiar with this situation. The guy says, my wife is the last to get ready and so slow that it's really irritating. It upsets me. She's a fine looker when she does break out, but is there any way for me to get her to speed things up? Well, not unless you don't care how she looks. You said that she's a fine looker when she breaks out, but I would suggest, what is it that she's doing while you're getting ready? Have you thought about it? Is she getting the children ready? Is she putting up things that you left out as well? Is she tidying up the house? What's she doing while you're getting ready? So you get ready and you're already chomping at the bit, so to speak. But has she gotten 2 or 3 children ready in the meantime, and then she starts on herself? But that sort of thing reminds me, oftentimes we're attracted to people. I've listened to so many couples talk about these things. We're attracted to people for a particular reason. Then you watch them over a period of time, and some of the things that they found particularly attractive to start with turns out to be a problem later. How about the one you just asked about? She's so well made up. Probably what attracted you to her in the first place. Now the complaint is she takes too much time getting ready. Turn a positive into a negative. How about this one? Oh, he was always the life of the party. I ask people, you see, often I ask, why did you get married? What did you find attractive about each other? And I ask each one separately. I've heard this one about being the life of the party quite a few times. Now, well, he never wants to leave the party. Never wants to go home. That's a complaint. Okay? Turn a positive into the negative. How about this one? I've heard this one. Either he or she, always so thoughtful. something very attractive to have in a spouse. After marriage, sometimes that complaint is always interested in other people, always taking time and spending time being thoughtful about other people. How about this one? Well, one of the things that attracted me about him or her was she was so frugal, she was thrifty, she really knew how to manage, or he knew how to manage. After marriage, old tightwad, stingy. Turned a positive into a negative. This one's sort of like the question we started with. She dresses so beautifully. One of the things at first attractive, that's natural. That would be attractive. After marriage, that gets turned into something like she spends too much money on clothes. Go from a positive to a negative. Here's one. Oh, he always had a clear answer. I've heard this more often about men. He always had a clear answer. After marriage, he's always bossing me. He always has an answer for everything. I don't feel like I have any freedom. Heard that one. How about this one? Oh, a real fun guy, always joking. After marriage, doesn't take life seriously. Can't get him to get serious. This one knows a lot about people. After marriage, real gossip. Yak, 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 yak. This one, was attractive because he or she was very dedicated to work. After marriage, spends too much time working. How about this one? Always on top of his career. After marriage, always studying, trying to get ahead. Doesn't socialize. Sort of related to that one, always widely read, well educated, can talk on most any subject. After marriage, reads too much. Has his nose in a book all the time. Before marriage, always had everything just right. After marriage, tries to be a perfectionist. You ever try to live with a perfectionist? I haven't. I've heard people talk about it. Certainly nobody would have that trouble with me. I'm not one. Here's a question. It says, kids act terribly today compared to what was expected when I was growing up. Where is it going to stop? Well, delinquency is a moving standard. What's delinquent is acting at variance to the norm, different from the norm. Whatever that is becomes delinquent. It doesn't necessarily mean it's criminal, it's just different. But what happened was we have whole generations that have standards, and so the standards move a bit. But you asked the question and you said different from what was expected, and the word expected, I think, is the secret in the clear answer. Children typically learn what the parents expect. And if parents expect children to behave a certain way, and they set the model for children to behave a certain way, the children behave that way. Most of the time until they get much older and decide for themselves, and even then the model and the pattern has been set. And those children will typically be pretty much on target, acting like most other people the rest of their life. They will be within the standards. So the standard the parents set is what they can expect in the children. These standards, though, vary. They vary because patterns vary, but that doesn't mean that they should vary widely. They vary within a narrow range, and all of us are that way. We all like to be a little different. It's one of our basic drives is to be different, to do something different. Most of us like to be noticed, and so we have to be a little different in order to be noticed, don't we? So kids today are just full of the same drives. I often hear people complain about the young people today, the kids today. But you know, I have never found a problem that the kids started. No, I may have been under a barrel someplace, under a tub, or a basket, whatever is your favorite comparison. But what children do in society is set up by the adults. It's like the adults pick the peers. Some parents don't want to hear that. Some people like to blame children's peers for all the problems the kids get in, but you pick the peers, the parents. How? By choosing the neighborhood they live in, choosing the school they go to, choosing the church they go to. You chose all these places. That's where the peers are. Peers simply means age mates, people the same age. We all have peers. But the parents' expectations. This seems to be the big difference in a lot of schools. We've heard a lot of differences about schools lately. The schools that have high expectations for the students do better. The schools that have little or no expectations, you know what happens. The children are always testing the limits. They're supposed to. That's part of growing up. They want to see what the parents allow. And too many parents don't know to set limits. And so the children keep pushing the limits. And if the parents have a movable limit, then expect the children to be moving them. Children have to do that in order to find out the limits and boundaries of the parameters. You want them to know where their yard is and where it isn't. You want them to know what's inside the house and what's outside the house. You want them to know what's theirs and what's other people's. If you answer yes to any one of those three by themselves, that requires limits. That requires boundaries. Parents have to do that. That's part of being the parent. Too many parents think they're going to teach their children to learn. No, they're not going to teach children to learn. They're going to learn in spite of you. Yours did, mine did, we did, in spite of our parents. Sometimes we learned what the parents wanted us to do, and that was a good thing. Sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we did other things. But we were learning. Nobody can keep us from learning. And we learn at any age. Okay, here's another question. So there's a storytelling going on in our local library for children. It seems to be much enjoyed. Is this something new? Not really. Libraries have been doing this for a long time, but storytelling is interesting. You think about it. Who used to tell stories? If you've read anything at all, you know that the old-timers, the elderly in the society were the storytellers. They had the history. They could tell stories about times and places and people before the children were in existence. And so they could tie things together. They could see the present, they could see the past. They were the historians of a community and a society. But storytelling has always been around. It's always been something very enjoyable for most people. You even see storytelling on television programs. Why can't the parents tell stories? Why can't the parents spend a little time talking? I think they could if they wanted to. They have an excuse. You've heard it. I've heard it. Too busy making a living. I'm going out supporting the family. I wish I had time to do that. Supporting a family without having time for children is not supporting the family. Children have other needs besides material needs. That interaction and telling stories and sharing and visiting with your own children, there's nothing to take its place. Daycare centers don't do that. Kindergarten, pre-kindergarten, they don't do it. And the once a week or whatever it is, storytelling in the library, as good as it is, I'm not knocking that at all. I think it's great. that doesn't take the place of the parents. Too many parents are insisting that they don't have time. Well, what do you have time for? Every time I used to say I didn't have time, there was somebody I knew who would remind me, well, is your day shorter than mine? How many hours in the day do you have compared to what I have? And I finally gave up saying I didn't have time. I know what's really involved is where do I put my priorities? What am I willing to spend time doing? Here's a question. I thought it was kind of interesting, but it jumped up. It says, you're always talking about families. What kind of family were you reared in? Well, I was the youngest in 4 children. My family was basically very poor in my childhood until World War II came along and 4 children all went separate ways. 3 of us went into the military. One, my sister, was in the waves. She was killed in a plane crash. But after World War II, my parents, their life and their economic status seemed to get better. And that was basically when I left home, was to go into the military. Here's a question. It says, do you think adoption is a good option? I certainly do, particularly if it's an option instead of abortion. I've worked with many people with adoption. I used to be the consultant simply because of the way the state of Texas was set up. The mental health department also included the orphans' homes. The state had orphans' homes. And I was a psychologist at the time I was working. We had access, opportunities, and sometimes need to work with kids in the orphans' home. And I'm very much in favor of adoption. And I've seen some good results and bad results about birth parenting, finding birth parents. Sometimes it's very sad. Sometimes it's very happy. And there's a question, and I don't know really what the best answer is. There's a question of whether or not somebody gives up a baby for adoption and really wants to cut the ties and not really be connected. And that's the way it used to be able, that was the procedure, the pattern, that could be done. And more the courts now are ruling that people have a right to know their heritage because of so many genetic studies and so on. Well, I'm not sure what my answer would be on that, but to answer the question about adoption, I'm certainly in favor of it. I'm also familiar with a group called PAPA, Prospective Adoptive Parents of America, PAPA. A lot of prospective adoptive parents out there waiting for children. So if you know anybody who wants to give up a child, there are plenty of people waiting. Here's the next one, the last one I guess we'll do for today, and that's about burnout. The question was, I hear a lot about burnout. We didn't used to hear that. Is it different? Do we have more stress today than we used to? No, we don't have as much material economic stress as we used to. Not at all. Burnout, I don't use. I've never seen people burned out because it's used to mean I'm depressed, I'm disgusted, I'm despairing, despondent. People who lose their reason for living, usually nowadays they'll jump around and call it burnout. Oh, I'm burned out. We're not burned out by overwork. I've never seen anybody overwork and burn out, so to speak. I see people overwork and get very tired and need to take a break. But that's not it's not really involved most of the time. I see people who lost their orientation for living and they call it burnout. Because if you lose the why of life, you lose the how. Sometimes people really need to stop and say, what's going on? What am I doing and why am I doing it? people referred to me sometimes because of burnout. And I don't know what that really is. It's kind of like somebody saying, well, I had a nervous breakdown. I don't know what that is either. I have to find out what the person really means and what the behavior is. So the next time you think about burnout, think about why. Why are you doing what you're doing, and what is it you don't like about what you're doing? Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.